Good afternoon. I want to thank New Direction for once again holding this very successful conference. And I don't have an opening statement. I wanted to start out this panel, and I want to thank my young but very distinguished panel. And so I'm very excited to be talking to this group today. However, I wanted to start out with a pessimistic observation. And I hate to do it. But here's my observation. If, in fact, conservative ideas and ideals and as a governing philosophy is supposed to be an attractive governing philosophy that properly understood a majority of people would support it, first of all, Juan, if anybody has a right to be pessimistic, it would probably be you, right? I mean, your country is run by separatists, communists, and the like, right? So,
and separatists.
And so, do you agree, first, that ours is an attractive governing philosophy that would, properly understood, have majoritarian support? And if you do agree with that, would our movement benefit if we acted like it? What say you?
Well, I say that definitely conservatism is currently not very sexy or not very attractive. For a number of reasons, one of which is that we haven't been really smart in the ways we need to convey those messages, so what this political philosophy is and implies. So it all goes to also political communication, etc. That's why actually some center-right or right-wing movements are critiqued as or branded as populists. It's a populism of the sort of non-ideological populism, but populism more of a political style, because it needs really communication, because we don't live in an era of rational people, but emotional people, so it needs to appeal to emotions. That's one difficulty, because conservatism appeals to reason rather than emotion, so that hinders the possibilities of conveying that message. And also, and this is the political philosopher in me, I guess, speaking, these core of ideas and set of values that conservatism is, the practice of those ideas is the practice of virtue. So the effort of a virtuous life and to have a virtuous citizenry. And virtue, by definition, implies effort. It's much easier to sit on the sofa and watch Netflix than to try be virtuous. And that's also why the recipients of those messages, which is society, finds it tough to follow this set of ideas, however right they are.
Picking up on that, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, because I think you're overly pessimistic in your questions, and probably even Juan is a bit too pessimistic. I'm not a conservative, so I can't really comment on the conservative angle. I'm a classical liberal, and I think the free market ideas are spreading, and they are reasonably popular. If you look at the development across Europe in the last 20 years, my region is the Central European region. It has gone through an immense transformation, an immense wealth creation was done because free market ideas were reasonably popular. Of course, we could improve a lot more. The Brussels bubble bureaucracy doesn't necessarily help our cause. But if you look at the liberalizing ideas when it comes to free trade and joining the single market, when it comes to deregulatory reform in former Baltic and Central European states, I think it has been a pretty immense success story from a Central Eastern European perspective.
I like the optimism. Marion, do you agree or you disagree?
Well, I would say that I try to be a cynic, but I can't keep up. If you look around the world from a geopolitical angle, in the last few years, we've seen 7 million people in Hong Kong now ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. Never before has that city been ruled by communism. You look at the Donbass, Georgia, Russia's periphery still destabilized. They're not talking about free trade or education or issues there. They're talking about safety and personal security. You look at Latin America, Venezuela, of course, we all know, one of the wealthiest countries, but then look at Mexico and Peru. Seems to be sort of socialist ideas on the march. Look at the United States, my home, and from what I see, it's not It's not that we have a mathematical problem or a logical problem. Our ideas work. If you're talking about free enterprise, voluntary exchange, the nation state, individual liberty. I mean, all of these ideas have been proven over time to be successful. So in keeping with the comments that have been said, I do think we're failing because of an emotional or messaging or whatever else. But I personally think it's deeper than that. I think that the left has for many years focused on education, culture, and I think our side has mostly focused on political candidates, elections, and policy. And that's great. But I think, and this conversations I think about think tanks as well, I think think tanks need to occupy that ground that is empty on our side. And, so I would take a Tocquevillian position, I suppose, and say that think tanks can expand and can fill the gap, can be intermediary institutions or even create parallel institutions. And you see this even in some of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And I agree there are bright spots, including Florida and a few other places. But I think we have to settle in for the long struggle that the left was willing to do decades ago.
Azeem, is there more to say on this?
Yeah, I agree with my American colleague here. I think we've been very complacent and in many ways arrogant in terms of our way of life and our political philosophy. If you look at in 1941, there were 11 democracies in the world, and today there are over 100. So most of the democracies in the world are actually less than 70 years old. Democracy itself, freedom for everybody, free market ideas, these are all relatively untested in terms of the span of time from a historical perspective. After the end of the Cold War, we all assumed that this is the current trajectory of the world, that this is the way everything is going to go. Countries will open up to free market economics for prosperity and so on. But the reality is that democracy today is under attack. Freedom is under attack. And much of this attack is coming from states that are now trying to create a new alternative system. The Chinese model, for example, with a command control market, they are trying to demonstrate that this is much more efficient. And this is a model that they are now exporting to other countries around the world.
I want to say that when we are cheerfully on offense, we have the ball, and you can only score goals when you have the ball. I want to ask you, Azeem, as lessons learned, you have had a fairly recent experience where the goal of all think tanks, of course, is not just to write policy papers that sit on shelves that people don't read. It is to promote those policies and eventually get those policies into the hands of decision makers who can put them into action, either a policy or a research paper that changes something, that gets into the hands of government officials and says something has to change. You recently had a report, your organization, on the Uyghur cultural genocide, if not an outright genocide. Tell us about how you did that and how it was successful and what others can learn from it.
So we're obviously here in Lisbon in Europe. The think tank scene in the United States, where I am based, and I've been based for the last 15 years, is very different from that in Europe. 1/3 of the think tanks around the world are based in the US, and some of them are household names. We've heard a lot about Heritage, Brookings, Cato, etc. And some of them have budgets of over $100 million a year. The RAND Corporation, over almost $1/3 of $1 billion. These kinds of numbers are unimaginable here in Europe for think tanks. Another key function of think tanks, which differ from Europe, is that think tanks in the US actually create policy for government. They actually have a very intimate relationship with the political parties. In Europe, policy is usually created by political parties and then implemented by civil servants. So in the United States, there is a huge appetite for think tanks to have an impact. A couple of years ago, I commissioned this report on the Uyghur genocide. And this was so the way I put this together is that the way I put all my reports together is I make sure that, first of all, that there is a market for the report. I was in academia before, and in academia, many academics take huge pride in the fact that they write reports that nobody reads. They actually do. Many academics will say, I've written a report that only 4 people in the world can understand. And that is obviously not the world that we now inhabit. You need to have, first of all, a market for your report. You need to ensure that there is an appetite for this subject matter. And I have in the past written reports for an audience of 1. So one policymaker that I meet, an ambassador, somebody from the State Department, member of Congress, who says, look, we are really interested in this topic. How do we solve this problem? And I would then commission my team to spend a considerable amount of time and resources for this single audience of one. So with the Uyghur Genocide Report, we were very fortunate. When I commissioned the report, I put together a coalition of academics and experts from all across the globe. So it was a global kind of project. And we basically put together a report over 8 months examining the Uyghur genocide. We gave it as an exclusive to CNN. It got over 200 million views on CNN. Secretary Pompeo used our report to make his own genocide determination, which then subsequently followed by sanctions. Other countries then, parliaments, debated our report. They passed various parliamentary motions and so on. We had the report translated, and it's still having an impact in the Uyghur Tribunal in London, etc. So we are essentially, the key thing is with all think tank reports, I think you need to ensure that there is a market for it. It shouldn't necessarily be a subject that you're interested in, but what the policymakers are interested in. And I think that is where a lot of the error can actually happen.
Adam Bartha, Azeem mentioned the enormous resources that the American think tanks have and how they work, and he juxtaposed that with the European think tanks. And given what he just said about his success with the Uyghur Report, how are the European think tanks, in your opinion, doing in terms of getting policy codified into law, turning reports into action, and are you willing to give them a grade?
You're completely right that their resources are incredibly different. If you look at the budgets of the largest free market think tank here in Europe, I think it's probably the IA. It has a £2.5 million budget, right? That would count as an incredibly small think tank in the US. But in terms of impact, I think they're doing a fantastic job. In terms of media connections and media hits, all of the European think tanks do have regular access to periodicals. They're regularly invited to TV shows. My friend Juan, I think you have a TV show twice a week. So in terms of impact, I think we are there, if not possibly in some countries in Europe better than our American friends, despite the incredible lack of resources. What is different is kind of the policy structure that we are dealing with, right? Because it's one thing that Spanish, Italian, Portuguese think tanks are doing a lot of great job domestically, but a lot of the regulatory affairs are coming from the EU. They are Brussels focused, right? And I think that's an angle that we haven't emphasized enough in the last 20, 30 years. So that's one of the reasons why we set up Epicenter, so our network of free market think tanks, because if half of the regulations come out of Brussels, we do need to be engaged and we do need to be present. But as individual think tanks with 5, 10 staff members in various European countries, we are too small to have a presence. So having a network and a united front in Brussels that stands up for free market liberalizing ideas, I think it's incredibly important, and it's probably going to become more and more important as the EU goes down in a federalizing way. So if I have to grade ourselves out of 10, I think we're at a 6, 7, but it's not impossible to get to 8, 9 in the next 5 years.
Improvement. Marion Smith, you work on both sides of the Atlantic. So what are some of the best practices that perhaps the European think tanks are learning from the U.S. think tanks? And is there anything that the U.S. market is learning from the Europeans?
Right. Well, in keeping with my comment a minute ago, we at Common Sense Society are really focused on trying to educate and bring people together. So try to provide some of the connective tissue, especially for millennials, Gen Zers. 2 weeks ago, we started rolling out some high school and middle school curriculum modules, and we'll be doing more of that. We have fellowships for young professionals, young scholars who would be out of university, so between the ages of 24 and 42. And we do that in Europe and the United States. And we find that just providing a place similar to this forum here, providing a place where you can gather around ideas and hash those out. Political parties aren't necessarily focused on that, number one. Their job is to win elections. Universities, which we have, I think our side has largely been excluded from, which is the reason I call for parallel institutions. And Out of, even for example in the Netherlands, out of our Common Sense Society network there over the last few years, we have a new institute that will soon be even granting certificates and degrees. And that is, again, a parallel institution to, fill the gap that is on our side. As I mean, we haven't addressed cancel culture, but it's very difficult to operate in the way the left does. The left does have their folks in the university system, in government, in the media. One of them can set an agenda, send it out at 7 a.m., and everyone's singing from that hymnal by noon. Our side in a lot of countries can't quite pull that off. I would say that in Europe, we're mostly not trying to fill the policy realm. We're trying to work with think tanks and partners, many of them represented in this room, and again, to just have those ideas-centered conversations. Because I do think it's extremely important for the think tank community, both classical liberal and conservative, to be correct. You've talked about the Uyghur genocide and China as a whole. I'm sure we're all looking at what's happening in China today, as it's very clear that economic freedom is, any hope of that is dead in China. But we weren't all on the same page there a few years ago when there was more than enough evidence about what the Chinese Communist Party was doing. So I do think we need to have forums like this where we can have robust conversations and make sure that we do maintain the moral high ground on whatever issue may be before us, no matter how difficult that may be. And, I think addressing issues like immigration, we have things to talk about and learn from Europe. I think Europeans can learn from Americans. We can learn from Europe. So I think staying centered on ideas and all, filling the gaps where we see them in the different countries. And we also, just on a note with Common Sense Society, we have a confederal model. So we're not pushing policies from Washington. We're active, especially in Hungary, the Netherlands, and the UK, and they're responding to the local circumstances there.
I'm glad you brought up China, and I'm going to get to China. So put your thinking cap on about that. I'm also going to get to trade, which is interwoven with China. But before I do, Juan Soto, I would expect when I come to a conference like this, I would hear a lot about free trade, free markets, individual liberty, individual freedom, individual choice, indeed, freedom to move about. And I've not been disappointed. There have been many eloquent speakers who have spoken on all these topics. However, you knew that was coming, right? However, there seems, and perhaps I'm wrong, that there is a broad agreement, while there is a broad agreement on these principles, there seems to be broad agreement that that freedom to move, freedom of individual choice may be limited to certain groups of people. Is there an inconsistency here? Or am I missing something?
What do you mean by a limited number of people?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about
because of precedents,
immigration, about refugees, and that's juxtaposed against this central idea of freedom and the individual individual choice. And I'm trying to reconcile, I guess, for our movement and the conservative thought and even liberal thought, is how do you reconcile these ideas of freedom, which we all have agreed on and people have spoken eloquently about, and then we seem to limit it when we talk about refuge. What am I missing? Is there a justification, a clarification? I'm all ears.
What is missing there, I don't think you're missing something, but there is a gap there, is the title of this conference. It all comes to the definition of freedom, I think. So those two conceptions of freedom that are opposed to one another, I guess, because of your question, would be freedom as an end in and of itself, which in this case, in the case of freedom of movement, would imply, well, open borders, etc. So it's no fault of your own that you're born in Zimbabwe, right? Why should your life expectancy be 15 years lower or less than in South Africa, to the other side of the border, right? To the more conservative or even classical liberal, in a true sense, in my opinion, the conservative version or definition or take of liberty, of freedom, which would imply that freedom is not an end but a means, there is something else. And that something else is what needs some protection, right? And at the same time, you have to think first of your own and then about the rest. And the liberties and freedom of your own, in this case, we would get into the whole language of nation state, etc., would come first. And then, and only then, when those liberties are secured, then you open up the borders and have the discussion on migration.
It's a Friday afternoon, so I'm going to be very, very controversial and disagree with Juan from a classical liberal perspective. Tomorrow I'm heading to Helsinki to talk about open borders. And I think open borders are a necessary requirement of classical liberalism. And that's where a lot of the conservatives and classical liberals disagree. Because Juan said that freedom is not an end in itself, but a means to get somewhere. And I agree. I actually do agree practically. But if you think about the fact that open borders would contribute to 90 trillion US dollars to the global economy. So we would double our prosperity like that by opening borders. I think the arguments to restrict immigration need to be very, very, very convincing and very high. And, I don't want to necessarily open up that debate between conservatives and classical liberals, but I just did. But I think that's a very interesting
You would agree
discussion.
a mature movement can have a discussion about it. We can have disagreement. We can agree to disagree. But yes, go ahead. Sorry.
I think we can disagree, and we do often disagree, very politely disagree within larger free market groups, and I think that's fantastic. But in order to build something that can be transformational, I think we do need to have a united front and focus on the areas where we agree on. And I think opening up kind of the immigration battle between ourselves, I think that's fantastic to do at the conference in a small group after lunch to be a bit controversial. But I think if that's going to be kind of the defining political trait for the upcoming 5 to 10 years, I feel that there would be a massive division that's not necessarily in the interest of classical liberals and conservatives.
Marion first, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I'll vigorously agree with both of you. I do think that it is important to have these kind of conversations. It is also important to recognize the true enemies of liberty and have, as you call it, a united front. Yeah, I think we could learn a lot from the united front effort of the Chinese Communist Party, and even in our own countries. But maybe we could also think about it in this way. I think libertarians and conservatives had to, in the 1990s and 2000s, figure out where our ideas played out in practice in an era of globalization. And I think that now we are entering an area of nationalism. I think nationalism is ascendant. And so I think now we have to also hash out how our ideas play out in this new era. And I don't think it's a complete shift yet. But, I mean, from my perspective, globalization is coming to an end. And the day where even countries as disparate as the United States and China could agree on it, those days are over. I mean, China is very much pushing a neo-mercantilist trading system, which is very hostile to all of the ideas that we would believe in from an economic side.
Juan Soto.
Well, I would argue, contra Adam, that any classical liberal, any classical original liberal would agree that the nation state is a prerequisite to the defense of those freedoms. And by definition, that implies a territory well defined by borders that distinguishes between ourselves and the rest. So one could also make the case that this is not really the distinction between a conservative and a classical liberal view, but that would be a battle between classical liberals. But some classical liberals would agree with what I just said. Secondly, I agree with you. Actually, I think maybe we can, well, that's up to you, but we can jump to China. Actually, yesterday we discussed the issue of China and free trade, etc. And what one could make, I was having a conversation later on yesterday with Jorge, and we were discussing that maybe we had to choose between free markets or free trade, but we cannot have both, which leads me to the issue of this new nationalist movement that is hindering globalization.
Can I just come in there very quickly? Yep.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Sure.
You can begin with your answer, but I think it may be appropriate.
Yeah,
so
go
we'll
ahead.
move on. I'm going to switch topics, but I'm actually going to stick with China.
Yeah.
So recently, as you know, President Trump had withdrawn from the TPP, which is Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's a trade agreement that still exists. And the Biden and Johnson administration recently embarrassed the French administration by agreeing to what amounts to a coordinated cooperation agreement with Australia on defense in the South Pacific. Okay, so putting all those things together, Azeem, I haven't mentioned Hong Kong, which Hong Kong was mentioned. What should we be thinking about China, and what should think tanks be recommending in terms of policies and ideas vis-a-vis China?
Sure. Well, I would take issue with your question. I don't think Biden or Boris Johnson embarrassed Macron. I think he embarrassed himself. And I think Europe has embarrassed itself when it comes to the issue of China. China seems to be the underlying theme in this conference that everybody seems to be avoiding. You know, this entire conference, the central theme is about defining freedom, is about protecting our freedoms, and the biggest threat to our freedom over the next generation is going to be China. China does not have allies. China only has states that it can exploit, or it has enemies. That's
Explain those
true.
relationships. How does China have leverage over?
China is essentially engaged in a process of economic colonization, debt book diplomacy. Now, you do not have to go far in Europe to see that. Just look over the border into Montenegro. But certainly look over in Africa. You know, China comes in with off-the-shelf packages of investment, infrastructure development, economic development, etc. And this is very attractive to most countries. And if you're an African dictator, if you're a dictator of any country, and the Chinese come in and say, well, we'll build your entire infrastructure and we'll also allow you to fleece some money off the top, which they actually encourage because that ensures that you will stay in power and the next regime does not prosecute you. So it's your incentives to stay in power. And the jobs are being created, you know, infrastructure is being developed. This is very attractive. But then once they have you, and we'll begin to see this over the next couple of decades, they will use this as economic leverage and they weaponize it. The Hong Kong situation was very interesting because we were all watching Hong Kong very closely. We were all waiting for the troops to enter Hong Kong. We were waiting for a repeat of Tiananmen Square. None of that happened because they have a much more effective model. Like the submarine deal is also very interesting, and I totally support this. I do believe we need to have increase our presence in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. But the Chinese will simply bypass all of this. I anticipate what will happen in places like Taiwan is that China will simply use all of its vassal states. And when you are engaged with China, if you have any sort of economic engagement with them, you cannot be neutral anymore. You have to be fully on board with the China project. Ask all the countries that have invested with China, and they'll tell you the same thing. They will simply weaponize an economic blockade of Taiwan. They'll create a civil war situation. Pro-Beijing voices will arise in Taiwan, which they'll then support for stabilization. They'll get everything that they want without any sort of military escalation.
So the Chinese, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we abandoned. I think it was announced yesterday that the Chinese have actually made an application to the TPP, which was actually designed to counter them in the first place. What is that all about?
Well, this is the biggest mistake. I wasn't a fan of the Trump administration at all, but I think on the China issue, Trump was absolutely right. I think he had the right policies, and I think the fact that Biden is continuing them is an indication that he was correct. But I think where the Trump administration went very wrong was in the America First policy, and that was when they started to withdraw from these global agencies, whether it was the WHO, WTO, UN, or the Trans Partnership. And now China simply moved in and started taking over these organizations. China now controls 4 of the 11 major UN agencies. No other country controls more than 1. They have penetrated almost every global agency, and they are essentially just taking them over one by one. Interpol, WHO, you can essentially just name all the alphabet soups, And the Europe has been so far behind on this. Europe is still trying to play both sides. And once you're invested with China, Europe will essentially become just a vassal state. And just one final point, in 2016, the OECD undertook a report called Going for Growth. They said the most significant economic trend over the next generation is going to be the decline of Europe. In the next 30 years, there's only going to be 3 economic powers in the world, US, China, and India. Europe will not be there. Europe will essentially become an extension of China. And this is why President Biden went with this deal with Boris Johnson, because they see the UK with this new integrated review as a bulwark against China. And Macron, Merkel, and all the other European countries are just so far behind in understanding this.
Adam, Bartha, Azeem has put a lot on the table.
Just a quick reaction. I agree with some of what you're saying, but I think the problem is, in some regards, actually worse, because Europe has become incredibly inward-looking and self-obsessed with itself. And that creates a vacuum, right? I mean, the US went down that route partially in the last 15, 20 years, I would argue, but the EU especially. I mean, if you look at our trade negotiation process with global pre-wealth economies, just look over to Latin America and the Mercosur agreement. It has been going on for 20 years, and now Macron comes in and finds new additional angles, new protectionist ideas, why we can't have more global trade and more freedom. So it's very, very tricky to have the kind of influence of liberal democracy across the globe if we have become protectionistic and self-obsessed with our own policies. But I think what you have mentioned about the end of globalization, I think that's where Europe and the US could work together and try to stop it, at least try to slow it down for liberal democracies. It's fair enough, maybe the trading system with China will need to drastically change. But I think that's why it becomes even more important that the rest of the globe and the rest of the liberal democracies work stronger together, both on trade and on geopolitical issues. And I'm not optimistic that this has been realized in Brussels yet, but I think the movements of the Biden administration, together with the UK and Australia, might actually force the EU's hand to have a bit more assertive foreign policy and a bit more of a global outlook instead of an inward-looking, self-obsessed one.
Marion, similar question, different topic. You wrote recently that Biden has claimed to end endless wars. Have we ended endless wars? We've left now the Taliban, who we defeated in 2001, is back in charge in Afghanistan after the coalition forces left. What has the Taliban learned since 2001? What has the West, the coalition forces, learned from 2001, if anything? And what should we expect think tanks to say in the framing of the entire Afghanistan experience vis-a-vis the next Afghanistan?
Right. Well, complicated question, but I did write on it, so I'll answer it. I'm not going to defend the Afghanistan strategy for 20 years. And there were multiple strategies and often at odds with each other. But I do think it is important to remember why we went in the first place, and that is because Afghanistan was a state actor housing and facilitating terrorist attacks on American soil. So I think we were absolutely justified in going into Afghanistan. That's a very different question than what we did once we arrived. I think we need to have healthy, robust conversations about the nature of U.S. statecraft. We are a commercial republic. We're a democratic republic. We have to take very seriously the idea, and talking as an American here, obviously, the idea of popular sovereignty. And so state building as a concept is very much at odds with that. But the Biden strategy in particular, we had gone nearly 2 years without a single combat fatality in Afghanistan. By war measures, that's pretty damn good. So there was no urgent reason from a tactical or strategic point of view to leave. In fact, there was every reason to stay. And now we see, of course, that the Taliban and China are negotiating. That's a perfectly predictable result. China is likely to occupy Bagram Air Base, which we built, and that is just a horrendous and unjustifiable squandering of 20 years of blood and treasure. So I think that we have to be very careful about the wars we fight, and we have to fight them sometimes, right? And just to connect it with China, a few years ago, I made the argument that we were in a new Cold War with China and that Hong Kong was the opening act, and that if made a comparison that we could think of Hong Kong in the same way as West Berlin. And at no point in the last few years could anyone imagine an American president flying into Hong Kong and staking that piece of territory as the West, and that's a line the Chinese Communist Party can't cross. So that's how far we are away, I think, from confidence in our own system as the free world. And until we sort of renew that confidence, and of course we live in the most prosperous, freest societies in history. We won the Cold War. We have every reason to learn from the successes and failures of the Cold War, and at least pay as much attention to that story as Xi Jinping said he has. He has said that he's studied Glasnow's perestroika, the American strategy in the Cold War, and that he's learned from it, and that he's not going to let that happen in the PRC. I do absolutely agree that with some of the tactics you were saying that China influences and really latches on to countries with strategic intent. I would also say that in our European and North American societies, elite capture has been a very effective means of neutralizing criticism of China, especially in universities, but also in think tanks. It would have been wonderful if the liberty movement writ large would have been early in seeing the threat of the Chinese Communist Party. Alas, we weren't as a whole. And just as the United States has now a whole-of-government approach since, I think, 2018, never before had the National Security Strategy named China as a top adversary, and that was done. As you mentioned, the Biden administration has continued that. I think we need a whole-of-liberty movement approach combating the Chinese Communist Party, because they are active through their diplomatic means, through the United Front, through their proxy actors in every single country of the world. And that is the challenge, I think, of our generation, because we're on the same age bracket here. And we have a lot to learn from the Cold War, but we are, I believe, having lost Hong Kong, now with the threat of potentially losing Taiwan, I don't think we're ahead of the game. I think we're actually in a very dangerous and precarious place, because we're either going to fight a Cold War with China or we're going to fight a hot war. And the longer we delay fighting the Cold War, the more likely, I believe, hot war is made.
Anybody disagree or agree with that?
Yeah, no, I would just like to add, I think I agree with everything that you said. I think, if you look back at the Clinton administration when they brought in China into the WTO, everybody was of the belief, change through trade, China will change its ways, we will export our values once the internet opens up China, etc. But if you look at the reality, the exact opposite has happened. China is now exporting its values throughout our societies. And if you're a part of any institution, any academic institution, just tweet from your Twitter account, stand with Hong Kong or Taiwan, and you'll see the Chinese embassy then come down on you. There's a ton of bricks, and your faculty members making your life difficult as well, because the Chinese students will be drying out. And if you want a better example of this, look at our largest, most influential cultural organization in the world is Hollywood. They will simply not touch China in any sort of criticism whatsoever. They will simply not make any film critical of China. And in fact, they have specialists now in Hollywood to make sure that the films are conducive to the Chinese market. And they'll go through all sorts of contortions, from the Top Gun movie to others, where they'll change the logos, they'll change maps to make it conducive to China. They are exporting their values into our society, and this, as the tentacles get deeper and deeper into our institutions, will just become much more pronounced.
Let me ask you this. So, Hong Kong at one time was a dock in the South China Sea, right? So in a sense, it's a fresh start. And they had trade with England, and of course they would, very similar to today, they were free to sell us many things, but they wouldn't buy anything. And so much silver started going to Hong Kong, which has led to the Opium Wars, and the they said, okay, we'll sell you opium, and then but we only take silver for payment. And over the years, Hong Kong got contract law, private property rights, many of the freedoms that we would say are overlay and necessary for prosperity. And guess what? Boom, we had an explosion. Having said that, does nation building work? Juan?
It does, but it depends on the means, I guess. So there was an article in Foreign Affairs in 2019, and the title said, it was something along the lines of the future of the international liberal order will be more conservative or it won't be. And it spoke about nation building or exporting liberalism or liberal values and how that would look like from a more conservative perspective. And the idea was that civil society organizations should do the heavy lifting and not states. Not only because then the critique of, civilizatory or cultural imperialism has to be accepted to some extent, but also because it's philosophically incorrect, because there's a contradiction there. It's an anti-liberal liberalism, so to speak. And third, because you have a de facto invasion from one state, however implicit and not explicit, meaning war, into another. And maybe that speaks also to the way the US has functioned in the Middle East and elsewhere, that has triggered a reaction that sometimes ended with the situation that was harsher than it was at the beginning.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? I'd like to I think we have time for one question from the audience. And I'm going to come to you. I've got the microphone. It's working. And I'm going to run right out here and hand it to you.
Hi, everyone. It's a great discussion. I'm from Croatia. I'm an MP and president for a newly created think tank. You touched on the basis on the theme of the budget size in the US and the European Union of the think tanks. I was wondering, do you see a difference in the structure and activities the think tanks do in correlation between the two unions?
Sure. Yeah, so I can start on that. Yeah, so obviously, as I mentioned, think tanks in the US, have immense influence. The most famous example of this is in the 1980s, when the Heritage Foundation produced a mandate for democracy, which was 1,100 words. And the Reagan administration implemented 60% of the recommendations across the board. Think tanks in Europe, many of them are connected to political parties. They don't have the same funding structure, so if they are funded, they're funding for a political party. But essentially, many think tanks in the US are part of academic institutions. We simply don't have that same in Europe. And unfortunately, Europe is just not producing enough of actual impactful material. And, the theme of this session is what can think tanks do? And I believe, and it's probably quite obvious, I think looking at the larger long-term geopolitical threats and trends that are happening within Europe are some of the things that you should be focusing on. There's multiple think tanks present here, and I think those are the kinds of issues that you should be focusing on from a geopolitical kind of perspective. So size doesn't necessarily matter, but what I would recommend for many think tanks to do is to try to build some coalitions across the board. So this is something that I do, and I try to do with every one of the reports that I involved in. I build coalitions of think tanks and academics across the board. So even if you're a very small institution, you can certainly reach out to others in the US and across Europe and try to build this kind of coalition that will have a much bigger impact.
Adam?
I think the basic structures are the same in the US and Europe. We are all second-hand dealers of ideas. We all need to be able to formulate reasonably complex academic policy recommendations in a more communicative, easier to consume manner. The big difference is, besides the resources, well, it's linked to resources, but the depth of research that we can do, right? So if you're a Croatian think tanker, probably you don't want to build a team of 30 full-time researchers, but you want to be able to utilize your network at universities, at other academic institutions, and have people working for you 20-30% of the time on a more ad hoc basis. I mean, the kind of setup partially because of the tax system in the US, right? There is a strong culture of charitable giving, fair enough, but also the tax system helps donations a lot better in the US than in European countries. We're never going to match the size of American think tanks, but I don't think we need to. I think in terms of achieving the same impact in smaller European countries with a fraction of the size of the American think tanks and the resources, it can still be possible. And I think one of the great examples is the Lithuanian Free Market Foundation. The work that they have been doing since the mid-90s has been transformational when it comes to Lithuanian politics. Their think tankers have been in and out of government, sometimes as advisors, sometimes as members of the government. They are very, very active on a daily policy level, both in the media and with policymakers. And Lithuania has by far overtaken some of the Southern European countries in terms of GDP per capita by now compared to the mid-90s. So it is possible to do the very impactful work on a much smaller scale, but I don't think we need to be able to have the same size staff and resources in order to achieve that.
Juan, we got a minute left. This is you're the last word.
Wow. Okay. I would just add that the Lithuanian case is a good example, but also is a bit of an exception because they've done so well. The country is also small, so more manageable, so to speak, if you are to influence the realm of ideas. I think one difference between the US and Europe, in this case, and I know Europe better, I guess, would be that we as civil society organizations, we can aim upstream, meaning politics, public policy, etc., or downstream. And in maybe larger countries or where think tanks don't do such a good work as the Lithuanian Free Market Institute, we tend to appeal to the general public under the impression that by doing so, when elections come, they will be able to affect politics and vote for one position or another on a matter of public policy.
And with that, Azeem, Adam, Juan, Marion, thank you for a great discussion. Thanks to New Direction for hosting us, and please stick around for the next panel. It's a very good panel. You'll want to see it. Thank you very much.